still connecting, but should be any second. Start sending us your software. Yeah, I'm doing that. Yep, now we are on. Great. So
we're on.
Hello everyone and welcome to the second live stream of the Philosophy Show. And yeah, we will just start by announced. We had some difficulties with the announced stream yesterday, but also nobody showed up. So we will start by kind of finding a topic that we want to talk about. And of course, I have to write in the chat that if you have anything, any suggestion for a topic, then please let us know.
Yes. So, yeah, there are so many topics one can discuss. So, the audience is free to suggest anything they want within philosophy or politics, theology, etc.
Yes, yes. While we have no views here, I just want to quickly try to do something because it seems that my internet connection is not optimal, so I will just quickly check that out. No, that should be quite okay, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. I'm trying to find the video or the streaming on YouTube myself as well. So
yeah, I guess I will actually share the link as well really quickly on Facebook. Just
there I found it.
Perfect.
By the way, I see that the sound and the audio and the video is working well on the live stream.
Very good, very good.
Oh, here we have Emil again. Good morning.
Hello, welcome back. Nice to see you. Yeah, where did you find the link? Oh, we have 3 viewers. That's great. Hello, everyone. We are happy that you're here. Yes, as we have said, if you have any philosophical topics that interest you, we are still in the phase of deciding on a topic, so please write them in the chat. I'm trying to find out just where this link is. Never mind, I can't do both things at the time. So, if there are so far no suggestions, I had I think 2 interesting suggestions in mind and possibly a third one that I have just forgotten at the moment. One idea was our long outstanding perhaps debate or discussion of censorship. So what is the role of free speech in a society and how much free speech should a society allow? Should it be completely free? Or yeah, we had some past conversations where we kind of touched on this topic, but then we never really discussed it in depth. So that would be one suggestion. And the second would be on the idea of vaccination, which is more of a practical issue, but it's something that I'm reading on currently. And so I'm reading this book here. It's a German book. It's called Vaccination, the Business with Fear. So the business model with fear, something like that. So these are 2 ideas.
Interesting and controversial subjects indeed.
Yes, we are trying to keep it trying to keep it interesting here.
Yes.
Yeah, 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 the third one had something to do. There's a comment by Emil. Um, we shall not have free speech on things that are against the Catholic teaching. Yeah, well, I guess some people would agree on that, but other people would disagree. But that would actually be the very first problem, because the Muslims would say we shall not have free speech on things that are against the Muslim teaching. And the Jews might say the same, and the Catholics and the Protestants. And so, how could we deal with this immediate discrepancy that opens up in a society when you follow this idea?
I think an important issue here philosophically is the role of truth. So one relevant factor in, you could say, arguing for or defending the idea that it is specifically this religion that should be protected and not this other religion is precisely because this religion is true and good and this religion is not. And I think that might be very, you could say, foreign to many people's minds, because the modern liberal kind of political thinking seems to be very much built upon an idea that no, we shouldn't really let the state concern itself with what is the true religion, what is the true philosophy. We should just leave that to the individual, and then let's just have politics about private property protection and protecting people from assault, etc. But I would not agree with that. I think that truth is unavoidable. Every government, every political society has some idea about what is true and good and what is not. So that would also be applicable to religion. One thing is, of course, that not all religions can be true at once, obviously, because they contradict each other. Now, some would say, well, they can be false, all of them, but that's not true either. I would argue that no one is the true, and that is the Catholic religion. So it gets back to truth, that certain things should be protected because it's truly objectively the case that these are true and good and important for human beings. So, yeah, that would be an essential element. It refers a little bit back to our discussion about setting metaphysics before epistemology, actually. But yeah.
Yeah, the problem is that, of course, other religions would say that their religion is the one that is true and Catholicism is false. So you need, if you are not just going to have religious warfare, then you need some standard outside of the teaching of one religion to address this question. Unless you are in a society which is to a very large majority of one identical religion, then that might not apply. But other than that, I think, and even then, because you will have warfare between societies, so I guess you will need a standard for determining truth which is outside of the religious doctrine itself.
Well, multiple things to be said there. First, I would say that it's true, of course, that many people have different ideas about what is the true religion. But simply because there are people who disagree is irrelevant to whether it's actually true or not. And this can be said about other things, like economic systems. We would say that private property is a valid right that should be, at least to a certain extent, respected in society. But of course, someone could say, well, the communists, they disagree. They think we should have another kind of economic system. But then we would just say, well, they are actually wrong, and we are right. And the government should respect property rights because that is the truth. So I would sort of make an analogy between economic decisions or political decisions in that sphere and also decisions about religion. When it comes to finding out what is the true religion, etc., well, that would be supported by what is called signs of credibility. That means signs, and it could include arguments, etc., that reveal this religion to be true and authentic. And this would be things like documented and well-established miracles, fulfilled prophecies, people would say, philosophical arguments, etc.
Sorry, could you repeat the last point about how you will determine truth?
Well, actually, there are sort of two distinct issues. One is what determines truth, and that would be a metaphysical issue. What determines truth is according to what I would believe, God himself. He determines revelation. But the other issue is, how do we find out the truth? How do we recognize the truth? And that would be, for instance, what is called the science of credibility. That is, signs and phenomena in the world that testify that this religion is valid or true or authentic. And these would be well-documented and established miracles. Some would add fulfilled prophecies. That is also certainly something. And also you could add philosophical arguments. For instance, we could automatically rule out polytheistic religions because the idea of polytheism is incompatible with the truths about God that we would know through reason or philosophy alone. So, yeah.
Yes, interesting points. Now I'm back on what I wanted to say. So, whoops, is the stream still okay?
I have now some messages that the stream is lagging, unfortunately.
Yeah, let me try to address that really quickly. Yeah, let's try if it's better now, and if not, then I will try something more. Okay. So yeah, concerning whoops, it seems to be lagging a bit. Yes, that's true. Stream is healthy. Okay, we will try to continue, and if not, we will see what happens. So I first want to agree with your point that whether or not people believe that something is true is irrelevant to it actually being true or not. So that which determines the truth of something is reality itself, or whether this statement correctly describes reality or not. So that's the first point I would agree. Now, the important thing I was getting at is more about how do we find out the truth of something. And this goes to this argument with the science of credibility, and I think this goes into this argument that you have sent me via email, that, for example, the Bible is a well-attested historical document, and therefore we can believe what it says, and therefore, etc., etc., it follows that it's true. But again, the same thing could be said of the Quran or of the Hindu or Buddhist writings, because these are also well-attested historical documents, and so by the same methodology you could also conclude that what they say is true, but still there is the contradiction between the religions. So I don't think this alone gets us to the desired goal.
Well, I would say that when it comes to texts such as the Quran, there are actually things about the Quran which would make it unreliable. That is, however, not the case with the Bible. For instance, the Quran makes claims about what happened to Jesus Christ. That is simply not historically the case. For instance, it claims that Jesus Christ was not actually crucified and died by crucifixion. And it would also deny his resurrection from the dead. But the Quran was written 5 or 6 centuries after Jesus Christ lived and died. So it would be very, very far out into history and very, very far away from the events that it describes about Jesus. But the New Testament is very, very proximate.
I'm sorry, Christopher.
And also number.
Just a
Yeah.
second. Let me quickly try to take care of this internet connection thing here, because it seems like the stream isn't really getting enough bandwidth or something. So I'm very sorry about that, but just a quick trying to fix that. Also, I'm sorry for the viewers. This is not ideal at all. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I should fix it, to be honest.
It seems like my internet connection is okay, so.
Yeah, I think my internet connection is okay as well, but there's another process running that I don't want to force to a stop. Or actually, I guess. No, it would be quite unfortunate, and I'm not sure if I can. Let's see. Yeah, I'm really not sure how to fix it at the moment, so I hope it will kind of work. Now it says the connection is good, but we have lost some viewers, which is unfortunate. Yeah, let's try and keep going and see if it works. Hopefully. Yeah, so you have been basically saying that the Quran is a less reliable source on the life of Jesus than the Bible.
Yes, because, for instance, what it writes about Jesus, the Quran is written 5 or 6 centuries after the life and death of Jesus. So that's very far away from the events. And also the New Testament, on the other hand, is written just very, very, very few decades after that. Even some of the books of the New Testament are written within a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So, and there are also other things as well that could be said. For instance, the Quran is actually self-contradictory, because this is called the Islamic dilemma, and it refers to the fact that several places in the Quran, it actually endorses the Christian Bible that existed at the time of Muhammad, and says that this is actually revealed by what they consider to be God, Allah, in other words. But that is very interesting, because that means that in Islam, in the Quran, endorses the Christian Bible, but Islam does not believe in Christianity. So you actually have an internal contradiction there, which would by itself invalidate the claims of the Quran. So there are many such facts that invalidate the Quran, but the New Testament, on the other hand, is far more historically reliable. There are a vast number of documents written very approximate to the events, written by multiple authors, multiple occasions, and also you have church fathers who build upon that and attest to several facts, and facts being recognized by multiple authors, independent documents. So there are many other facts which play into this as well.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, you would probably disagree, but as far as I understand, the Bible is also self-contradictory if you read it in a certain way. And still, even if the Quran wouldn't be a good source on Christianity, it would certainly be a good source on Islam. So I just think this kind of argumentation doesn't really go anywhere. It's kind of, everybody says, well, no, my source is right and your source is wrong, and my source is better or more proximate or has more eyewitnesses or this or that, but it's all quite difficult to know. You also don't know, even if the first book of the the New Testament was written just a decade after Christ's death. You still don't know how much it has been edited since then. So I just think this line of argument isn't really productive and isn't really, I don't think it's going anywhere. So, and I certainly don't think we should base the censorship of our society onto this line of argument.
Well, multiple things I would say to that. Well, you could argue, perhaps, let's say for the sake of the argument, that the Quran is reliable in telling us about events that were contemporary to Muhammad, that this is what happened in 6th century or 7th century Arabia at the time of Muhammad. Perhaps you could say that, okay, the Quran is reliable in these things. But that wouldn't by itself prove Islam in any way, because, yes, there was this Muhammad and he was around and preaching his new religion, etc. But there aren't any very good and decisive miracles that it is reliably accounted for by the Quran. As far as I know, I think that was one of the problems, that Muhammad was not even able to produce any miracles. However, when it comes to what the New Testament reliably documents, they document a very strong miracle, that is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That's one of the most central features of Christianity, that he was raised. St. Paul, in his letters in the New Testament, says that if Christ had not been raised from the dead, our faith would be pointless. It would be in vain. There would be no basis to have our faith on. So, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ is attested very well in the books of the New Testament. Again, just looking at them through purely strictly historical lenses, without assuming them being inspired or something. Okay, so when it comes to contradictions, well, there are people who would say that, the Gospel of Matthew contradicts something about against the Gospel of Luke in some of the details about how many women went to the tomb, etc. However, two things to be said there. There are professional biblical scholars who have done a lot of research into this, who would argue that no, these are just apparent contradictions. They can actually be reconciled. And I don't see that happening with the Quran, because the contradiction here is very, very bold and direct, not in the same way as the contradictions in the Bible is. Second, these contradictions concern just minor details about, the number of women went to the tomb, etc. And historians would actually treat a series of documents, even if they might contradict each other in minor details, still on the major points, they might be historically reliable. So that is one of the important things, that the authors, perhaps they would be forgetful of some of the few details. For instance, here's a good example. Let's say there had been a terrorist attack somewhere in the world, and there were some witnesses. Now, when the witnesses are going to tell the media or the police about what they saw happen, their reports are not necessarily going to be exactly the same. Some might emphasize some things more than others, and perhaps even some might mistake a few details here and there, so there might be some contradictions between the reports in minor details. However, the major points of their witness reports, that they saw an explosion, etc., for instance, those would of course be very, very reliable, even if some minor details that are not that relevant might differ. So I would say this sort of the same thing about the Bible, even though of course I do not believe that there are contradictions in actual reality, because I believe they are inherent, and I do believe that there's apparent contradictions can be reconciled. But even if we assume, for the sake of the argument, that there are these contradictions in minor details, that would not invalidate the reliability of the major things that are documented. And also, just briefly, there are also other arguments from Christianity, not just the historical argument for the resurrection, just to let this pointed out as well.
Just a brief technical question. Is the stream okay now? Could,
let me see.
For example, Emil give us feedback, or someone, if someone is watching, or if you can see it?
Yeah, when I play the live stream myself, things seem to be going well.
Great, great. No, that's good. I just wanted to really quickly check that. Okay, so, and yeah, Sorry for the technicalities. Now, to your arguments, there are 2 points I want to address. And the first is, I'm not talking about contradictions in details like the amount of women that were in a certain group or something like eyewitness report differences. I'm talking about fundamental contradictions in the whole belief structure. Like, for example, there is this idea that God is all good and all powerful, and that Jesus died to take away the sins of man, but the women suffer during birth was imposed on human beings because they Adam ate the apple and Eve tempted him and also ate the apple, and so but women still suffer during childbirth. It's not like this has stopped thanks to Jesus Christ. So these I'm talking about big kind of contradictions in the explanation of reality, not just some minor details. And perhaps we could address this first and then talk about miracles are not, in my mind, a sensible study field, like a scientific field of study. So that would be the second problem.
So to the first thing, where exactly do you see the contradiction, if you could be very specific?
Well, if the sin has been taken away, then the effect of the sin should also be taken away. I wouldn't punish someone if he was already had already paid off his debt.
Well, to that point, I would say that, well, first of all, it's possible to take away the sin without taking away something that might be the effect of sin. You could perhaps compare that to someone making immoral choices in life, and that affects his body because he has, I don't know, taken drugs or something. He could radically change his life and become virtuous, and yet that effect from his past might be present. Now, perhaps someone would argue, well, why wouldn't God just take away the effects of sin as well as the sin itself? Like, for instance, in baptism, that is when all the sins are taken away and the person is made pure spiritually. Why wouldn't he take away all the disease at the same time, for instance? Could be a formulation of that. And I would say that, well, God could leave effects of sin there for some good. There might be some spiritual benefit for that. For instance, a person who is receiving some disease, he could use that disease or the pain he feels or something like that to promote some good. For instance, there is this principle that suffering can help to purify the soul and make it more virtuous and less entangled in pleasure or something like that. And there is also the principle that you could use your suffering to the glory of God, that it's a sort of a sacrifice, and you can obtain merits for the sacrifice that you will be rewarded with in heaven. So there are multiple ways one could see that these things can be there to promote a certain good, that these are actually opportunities given by God to actually help you purify your soul, obtain merit, etc. And also there will be a state in the future where all the effects of sin are removed as well, and that is the resurrection of the body, when at the Judgment Day all the bodies will be resurrected according to Christian doctrine, and then there will be no disease, no defect, nothing like that, no pain, and everything will be absolutely perfect. But in this temporary period, God could leave the effects of sin for a greater good. And even if you might say, well, I'm not exactly convinced that this might be a justifiable good for this and that, well, still you could say that, well, just because we might not understand the reason why doesn't mean that the reason doesn't exist or that it is impossible that God would have such a reason. So that would be to number one. Perhaps you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I see that you can make such an argument, but I don't think it's convincing, I just have to say. And I can't like prove that, but there is this idea of what's it called when you have a hypothesis and the hypothesis gets refuted, and then you just automatically generate a second hypothesis that includes this refutation of the first one. I think I don't remember how this is called. It was something to do with Occam's razor. So, for example, somebody might say the Earth is 6,000 years old because it says so in the Bible, and then a scientist might say, well, why then does there seem to be good evidence that carbon dating suggests that there have been animals that are millions of years old? And then you can just create the second hypothesis. Well, God must have made it so to test the faith of man. And so you can just come up with an ad hoc explanation. That was the term. So you come up with an ad hoc explanation that allows you to keep your theory intact, but it just makes it more and more convoluted and less convincing. And so, yeah, I just don't find this type of argument very convincing or very productive. And I guess this goes to the second point about miracles not being a proper field of study. And this has to do with the problem of axioms or of worldview. So each person, I guess, inevitably has certain axioms or certain assumptions that he probably subconsciously derives from his experience of reality, but these are kind of the basis on which his thinking builds. And if you have the axiom that there is an all-powerful God who can intervene in the cause of material reality and do these things that we call miracles, then you might think that this is a plausible explanation. But if you have another axiom, namely that there is just matter and energy, then you will just not think of this as a plausible explanation, no matter what any story in any book says. That's like if your eyewitness in New York would say, yeah, I have seen this man, he has drawn a squared circle. Well, you wouldn't believe it even if there were 100 eyewitnesses that said the same thing, because you don't by axiom believe that a squared circle can exist.
Well, there are multiple things to be discussed there, but I mean, I would say that the issue that we were talking about is, okay, is there some huge contradiction within the Christian worldview? And the point is, there can't be established that the omnipotence or the omnibenevolence of God or omniscience of God would be incompatible with him allowing pain and suffering or bodily defects or suffering during childbirth. Sort of the claim was that these two things are incompatible with each other. But the point is, well, we don't see any reason to think that. Because even if we can come up with a reason, and I think we can come up with a good reason, but or we cannot fully 100% understand why, but I think we can make some good suggestions. I don't see any way one could argue or believe that, no, there must be a contradiction. There is no way these are incompatible. And if it can't be established, if it is possible that, no, there might be a way in which these two can be reconciled, then one can't make the claim that there is a major contradiction in the Christian worldview. So that would be, the point is that would refute that claim. And that is why the points I made would be good to refute that precisely. When it comes to the issue of ad hoc, etc., no, I don't think there is some doctrine that what you must appeal to ad hoc to make it explained. Even though I think the idea of ad hoc is sort of perhaps a little bit problematic, because how do you determine whether something is ad hoc or simply an elaborate explanation? It seems perhaps a bit problematic. But when it comes to, by the way, the issue of how old is the Earth, how young is the Earth, that would be a very interesting discussion as well, and I could get into that. But I think there are ways to reconcile this without ending up into some logical problems. So when it comes to miracles, obviously, if you have an axiom, which is that only matter and energy exist, then obviously miracles are not going to be helpful, because you automatically from the start exclude the existence of God and supernatural realms, etc. But then, of course, the issue would be, well, why would you hold such an axiom? There's no evidence that only matter and energy exist, and there is no reason to obtain it either. And furthermore, I would say we have actually very good arguments that there is something more than matter and energy in the universe, or in reality. I would say in reality, and also in the universe. So yes, it would require not an axiom, but it would require that one is open to the idea of a supernatural reality and to the existence of God. And that is what I, of course, would suggest, that everyone is open-minded to the evidence for Christianity.
Yeah, again, many points to address. I guess, first of all, I would agree with your statement that this ad hoc notion is somewhat problematic, so I would agree with that. And I also see that you say you cannot specifically prove that this is a contradiction with the childbirth, etc., because there might be another reason for the suffering, so a reason that human beings don't understand, which is true, but that doesn't mean that it's a convincing explanation, because you can explain anything with there might be a reason for it that human beings don't understand. So I understand that, and I'm not just trying to make fun of this statement, because I think it's actually a valuable way to look at many things, but still it's also not an explanation, a positive explanation for anything. It's just basically a useful starting point to approach problems you don't understand. And perhaps my example was not the best one. I wasn't really prepared for having a very deep debate about these issues, so I would perhaps say I might come back with a better example of a contradiction in Christian doctrine, even though I still think the one that I presented kind of, let's say it like this, I don't understand how this would make sense if God was all powerful and all good, but that's perhaps really a separate discussion. And I think to tie it back to the problem of how was the name? Censorship. To tie it back to the problem of censorship, we already see that we must be able to have discussions like this in order to establish the truth value of a certain claim, like your claim about the Catholic faith. But if I would have to risk being fined, imprisoned, or tortured, or killed for making any of the statements that I have made so far in this conversation, then we couldn't really come down to the bottom of it and see if the claim actually holds. So this would, in my mind, be a very strong argument exactly for free speech and against censorship, at least in the realm of discussing ideas. Perhaps in the realm of advertising ideas or advertising certain forms of behavior, like if a communist party advertises that people should rebel or should, I don't know, stop using money, or should block the entrance to factories, or stop going to their job, or like these kinds of things, perhaps you could make a case that they harm society and therefore should be limited. But the discussion of pure ideas, I see it's very problematic if it's censored.
Okay, so yeah, two things I would like to say. One thing on the first point you make, to sort of make my remark on that, and then I'll move on to the censorship issue. Yes, the point was not to make a positive case that there is no contradiction between these attributes of God and the existence of these things in the world, Rather, the point was to show us that there is no way we can say that it is a contradiction, that the one claiming there is a contradiction has the burden of proof, and all that I'm saying is simply that, well, the burden of proof on his side has not been met. Now, if I claim that there is absolutely no contradiction between that, you can say, well, that's a burden of proof on me, but I didn't make that claim. I simply refuted the opposite claim. And therefore, that the fact that I haven't produced a 100% certain explanation of why God allows this and that, that was not the point either. It was simply to refute the negative claim. And also, one thing, a very interesting question I would like to ask as well, and then I'll move on to the censorship issue, is if you would grant that, okay, I don't have the accent of materialism. Let's suppose, for the sake of the argument, that I am fully open to the idea of God and miracles, and for the sake of the argument, would leave aside whatever theological or philosophical problems you might have with the Christian worldview, and simply look at the historical data concerning the resurrected Jesus Christ. Would you then be open to the idea that perhaps the resurrection would be objectively the best explanation if it fits the data, has the most explanatory power, most explanatory scope, and fulfills these scientific criteria, that you would be open to the idea that this could actually be objectively the best explanation and therefore having an argument for Christianity? So that would be a question for you there. Okay, now to the censorship issue. Or do you want to respond to these points first and then move on?
Yeah, let me quickly answer to this. I mean, I see the point that you have to be open to an alternative explanation of reality if you are going to talk about these things. So I'm not saying I have this axiom in the sense that I have consciously decided this is my position and I'm not going to move away from it no matter what. I mean axiom more in the sense that I actually happen to believe that this is the case, and this statement cannot be reduced to a lower level which proves the statement above, like there exists only matter and energy. I just happen to think that this is the explanation of reality that best fits what I perceive of the world. It's not like I wouldn't change it no matter what, but I at the moment believe that it's true. And concerning this idea of the resurrection, I just can't help it, but it just seems very unplausible to me, and it seems like, I don't know, wishful thinking, that people wish certain things might have happened, because if you will look, and we have to read the comments after my remark, because Emil has written a couple of comments. But just quickly to make this point, there are multiple accounts of resurrection in the Bible. I think the prophet Elijah resurrects a certain child which has been dead, even in the Old Testament. I think there were other people who were resurrected as kind of proving that someone is acting with God's blessing. So, and why are there certain people resurrected and not others? I just don't think it's a sophisticated explanation. I just can't help myself. So, because every parent grieves for their child, but then someone kind of by random choice has their child resurrected, and all other people have their children not resurrected. And also, I have never known anyone personally, or known anyone who has known anyone whose child was actually dead and has then come back to life. And so if God were in the habit of sometimes resurrecting people, then why does he do it on certain occasions and not on others? So it doesn't make sense to me, and that's why I don't believe it.
Okay, so just a brief remark, and then we could move on to the other issues and the comments. Very interesting comments you gave there, Emil. Very interesting points. Okay, so yeah, I mean there are these philosophical issues of, okay, are there good evidence for having a materialist conviction or not? And I would of course disagree, and we could get into that. But if we even leave aside all possible reasons one might put forward for materialism and just leave aside all of that philosophical issues and simply look strictly speaking at the historical data and act like a historian, scientifically finding out, okay, we have this data that is well established, what is the best explanation for them, like the empty tomb and the death of Christ, and also that all the disciples had experiences, and all these facts and other facts as well. What is the best explanation for these facts? Well, the resurrection would objectively, according to the criteria of explanatory scope, explanatory power, etc., would actually fit the criteria better than other naturalistic explanations. Could it be a judgment to make if we leave aside theological issues also, such as why does God resurrect some and not others, if we simply leave that aside for the sake of the argument?
Yeah, well, I don't think we can leave it aside. And because I cannot leave it aside, I come to the conclusion that the best explanation of this historical data is that the Bible is actually a story which wants to communicate a important message via metaphor, like stories do. That it's not a physical resurrection that actually happened, like a document of evidence that you can perhaps, I don't know, today we would have videotapes, but back in the time you had eyewitness accounts. No, it's not that at all. It's a story that tries to convey a message and an ethic and moral rules, and it does this by means of being a story, not by means of being a philosophical paper. And that's why I think that's the best explanation for this story in the Bible. That's my view.
Well, that would be an issue of genre. What genre does the New Testament belong to? And I would certainly say that it's very clear that he's talking about a historical event witnessed by eyewitnesses, just as you have historical records of here is a war that broke out in this year. It's the similar kind of thing. But okay, perhaps we could move on, and then perhaps again I would love to return to those subjects in the future, because I think these are extremely important and crucial, obviously, because of the implications of Christianity being true. But yes, okay, so
perhaps read the comments of Emil and then we can address them.
Right. Okay, so Emil says, do you think speaking freely and promoting bad things is good, or do you think it should be censored to prevent bad things to happen in society and prevent bad things to be accepted? Or do you guys think that we shall answer the free speech even if it's bad and help those people out with good, strong arguments? Yeah, so I think this gets to the core of this issue. Do you want to respond to it first, or
you can go ahead.
Right. Yes. I think I would absolutely say that there are ideas that are harmful and bad to society, and I think this is very clear. For instance, communism, Nazism are ideas about society and human beings, etc., that are immoral and wrong, and would actually undermine a good and just society. And hence we see that, well, these ideas can be spread by people producing videos and articles and books and propaganda of various sorts, political campaigns, and thereby spread the ideas out to the public. And if that gets spread successfully, that could harm the public morality of that society, and or perhaps provoke some collapse even in some cases, or revolution in other cases. And also just undermining the morality of the human beings in general. If you have a hedonistic philosophy saying everyone should do whatever they want and there should be no moral limits, pure license, the only things that should be prohibited are laws against theft and assault and violence, but there is no virtue, etc., then that would, if it spreads successfully, that would undermine the public morality of the human beings. At least that is a risk. And just as a society would prohibit literal poison, I'm not talking about physical poison, as saying that this should not be distributed on the market, intellectual poison is also something that should not be spread. And therefore, just as we would protect society against harmful things when it comes to physical things, we should also protect society against harmful intellectual things as well. So that would be an argument for censorship of certain grave evil ideas. So that would be an argument, and I could respond to the issue of okay, but don't we need free speech to discuss these and all that? But perhaps you want to respond first.
Yeah, I would, and thanks, Emil, for this input. I think this is really the heart of the matter, and I think the best way to deal with bad ideas is to show why they are bad and to disprove them with sensible arguments. So I would hold the opposite view, I think, from Christopher on this issue here. And the point is, of course, bad ideas can spread in society, and of course, as you said, they are kind of like an intellectual poison. They can really poison the morale or the holding together of the society or cooperation or the functioning of society, basically. But that doesn't mean that they should be censored, because I think two things have to be said. First of all, when you censor something, you immediately also make it interesting for people who are curious, and many people are very curious actually, and so they will want to go and look at prohibited things just because they are prohibited. Second, you add to the credibility of these ideas if you ban them, because people can say, yeah, well, you see, it's true, that's why they want to ban it, because it doesn't serve the elite of this society and blah blah blah. And so you add to the credibility of bad ideas when you ban them. And the third point is, human beings come up with bad ideas all by themselves all of the time. It's not like you have to ban the idea of hedonism and then nobody would by himself come to the idea that he should that he could just do whatever he pleases because that feels good. Like, this idea emerges spontaneously in almost every person, I would assume, and therefore it's not like if you ban it, it doesn't exist, but if you ban it, then you just don't have good arguments against it, which might help people to come to a better, truer, or long-term viable position.
Many points there. So the first one, it seems, would be that when it comes to showing or dealing with false ideas, one should, in a way, demonstrate that they are false, and this would imply some sort of discourse or free discussion, where you argue back and forth in a say, or more generally just a discussion in society. Would that be what you argued for, or right? Well, I would say that certainly this is one way that could be dealt with. However, it is even better to, in certain cases, also censor them, because truth does not need to be defended against error in order to be true or protected. I thought sort of perhaps that myself in the past, but when I think about it, I don't see any reason that true ideas necessarily should be such that false ideas have to be able to spread in society so that truth can be defended. It seems to be that no, truth can be defended just by also being protected against the infection of false ideas in society that are harmful. So I would challenge that premise. There is this is related to this liberal idea of the free marketplace of ideas. The idea that if you have sort of a free market in ideas, people would explore all sorts of different convictions and philosophies, etc., then eventually good ideas will win out, because people will see the merits of these arguments compared to these arguments, and eventually the good and true ideas will dominate. I am not saying that this is the argument you put forward, but I'm just saying that this is a common argument. And I would challenge that premise, because unfortunately we see that people can easily be misguided by demagogues, by propaganda, by false arguments that might appear convincing, by rhetoric. And of course we have many examples of this today and in history. Just look how many bad arguments have been presented and deceived many people. So unfortunately people are not that rational that they can just see the merits of good arguments compared to bad arguments and then conclude accordingly. So therefore, it seems like just as you would prohibit certain physical poisons, intellectual poison also should be prohibited, and it's not enough simply to rely on the idea of the informed customer or informed consumer. So that would be sort of a point there. And it reminds me of something that Pope Gregory XVI said about free speech. He said that, well, the idea that, well, we have these false ideas that can be spread, but we can also produce good material, true material, that refute these errors in society. He said, well, that wouldn't really make sense, because an analogy to that would be, well, we can allow physical poison being published in the market as long as we also produce antidotes and sell those on the market. That would sort of be a remedy. No, it's not enough. We have to also do something against the physical poison itself. So yes, those would be some points. I know you made more points, but I don't remember them exactly right now, so that would be my thoughts on your first one.
Yeah, I think just really quickly, this analogy really doesn't hold because, yeah, it seems to come from a different class of problem. So I don't think it holds. I would quickly address one thing that Emil has said in the comments, namely that bad ideas can also be spread through secret meetings. That's how Hitler came to power, and therefore I think we shall not accept free speech. But I don't think that this argument makes sense, because if bad ideas can also spread through secret meetings, then that exactly means that even if you limit free speech, the bad ideas can still spread in society. And so therefore censorship doesn't work. And I think that's the main problem with it also. The first, or one of the main problems. The first problem is, who will you give the power to enforce censorship? The second problem is, based on what standards will the censorship be enforced? Like, this goes back to our first part of this conversation. How do you determine what is actually true? Because even if you think that you have the absolute perfect truth, you might also be wrong. You are also just a human being who can err. And so that's a big problem number two. And then problem number three is, how do you actually enforce it if you think you solved problem 1 and 2? Because do you want a society where everyone spies on his neighbor and reports his neighbor secretly to the secret police so that they come and punish him because he said something which is censored? I think this is not a very pleasant society to live in. There will be no trust, and trust is crucial for the functioning of a society. And so I guess I could say more, but I will let it at this and let you reply.
Yeah, many points there. I might not entirely remember all the points you made in comment, but I would say that, well, it is true that yes, bad ideas would spread through secret societies, and those secret societies could operate even when there is censorship. But it wouldn't help that they are allowed to spread their false ideas in public. It would actually just be worse. And yes, some of the points you made previously that, well, if some ideas is censored, then it might be, some people might be curious, oh, perhaps it's censored because it is a true idea. And I have thought about that myself in the past, but when I think about it, there is no reason to believe that that would necessarily, or even tend to be the case. That could be the case, but it could also be the case otherwise, that people are thinking, oh, this is prohibited, hence I should stay away from it. Obviously there are exceptions, and there are people in the world who would think the opposite, that, oh, it's prohibited, perhaps I should look into it. But I actually think that there could be just an equally strong case that people in general, or at least a significant number of people, would stay away from ideas if they were prohibited. And that seems to me to be the case today, when you see various platforms being banned from social media, cancel culture, and all that, it seems to be working in the sense that there are people who would not check out these and that ideas because they've heard, oh, they were banned from YouTube because of hate speech. Now, again, the hate speech laws, I don't endorse that at all. I'm simply using that as an illustration of the point that certain ideas being banned and shunned could be useful in helping people to not check out something they otherwise would check out. And you could also appeal to this economic argument that you have this concept of supply and demand. Supply, that is that which is produced to the public in the market, and the demand is people who demand and are willing to pay for this and that good. Now, if the cost of obtaining something is greater, people will be generally less inclined to obtain that if it's more costly. That's an obvious logical idea. Similarly, when something is prohibited, it would obviously be more costly to obtain that which is prohibited. And therefore, people will be, according to this economic principle, less inclined to obtain or seek out those things. And that is also an argument for why you could say drugs should be prohibited, etc., although that would be another discussion. Hence, you could make this argument. Now, again, you could say, well, but people have an incentive to look for those arguments precisely because they are censored, because, oh, it's conspiracy and they want to ban the truth. Yes, it's possible, but again, it's also, you could turn the argument around and say, well, it's possible people will not check those ideas out because they perhaps trust the government and don't want to do that. Yeah, there were more points that you brought up, but sadly I don't remember all of them, but at least here are some remarks.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it is true what you say, that some people will stay away of ideas because they are banned, and other people will look at them just because they are banned. And I guess that has to do if you are more of a person believing in authority or more critical of authority, or if you have a more beneficial view of your government or a more oppressive view of your government. So if you think the government is oppressive, then you will think the ideas are banned because they are true, and then you will look at them even more. But if you think the government is beneficial, then you think they are bad, and then you will agree that they should be banned, I guess. And so, yeah, I have to... Also, I wanted to just address this... No, I will address this point later. I will first address this point here that Emil brought up, that we should just have a strong monarchy and the church, and then the bad ideas could be kept in check, basically. I think that's the gist of what he was saying. And I get the feeling that this is also a little bit what you, Christopher, are saying, but I just have to express that this is actually the mindset of a totalitarian. Totalitarian people think that if I or my group just had the power, then we would use it for the cause of good, and then it would all be good, because we have goodness and truth firmly and unshakenly on our side. But I don't believe that any human being or organization is perfect, either concerning truth or concerning goodness. I think every human being, and therefore every human organization, has evil in their heart and corruption in their structure, and therefore it's a bad idea to give any group or individual the total control, for example, over what people are allowed to say or not to say. I think that's just a terrible idea. And even I would agree that people can easily be misguided by demagogues and bad arguments, and that many people cannot think very deeply or very complex, and can be misguided by emotional arguments or appeal to emotion or these kind of things. But still, it's the less bad solution to have an open discourse than to just have a totalitarian form of government. That's my impression.
Okay, so again, many points there. First one, I would say one thing that is very, very valuable in censorship is precisely that people will never hear of certain ideas because they are banned. There is this expression, out of sight, out of mind. If you don't see something, you're not going to think about it. If you're ignorant of it, then you're ignorant of it, so it's not going to concern you. Now, and I think if you have a prohibition and censorship of certain bad ideas, then due to that, many people are not going to be aware of those ideas. They're not going to see publications of it, not going to see interviews in the public, etc., because that is not allowed. And therefore, they'll be far more protected against such evils. So I can imagine some person who has a true and good idea of reality, but sadly he's a bit weak in the sense that if there were some demagogues presenting rhetoric and propaganda to him, he might be inclined to listen to that and fall from those true ideas and begin to become convinced of bad ideas. But because the state or some institution in society prevents him from listening to those ideas, now he can continue on holding on to the truth and the good and not be exposed to danger in that field. So I think that's a very good and valid point to consider for why censorship has a role. Now, this idea of this concept being totalitarian. Well, first of all, I don't think totalitarian is the term that you have in mind. It's rather authoritarian, because totalitarian has more to do with total government control over all aspects in society. And that is most certainly not what I endorse. But perhaps you're looking at authoritarian. That is, that there should be this authority that controls certain things when it comes to what is allowed to be said and not. Yeah, perhaps you could use that term authoritarian. But I would disagree that it's a bad thing to have a government that imposes the truth in certain ways and in certain cases against falsehood. Because if there truly is a truth and there is a true moral system that people should follow and it's essential to follow, then it makes sense that, well, the government must take that into account. And also here is a very, very important point. In all political systems, in every system, including a system which you would also support almost, there will be a government that has some idea about what society should be, and it will impose those ideas in one way or another. For instance, both of us would support the idea that there should be respect for private property rights to a certain degree, and there should be trade in society to a certain degree. Now, that is an idea of what should and should not be in society that the government will impose by punishing those who violate those laws. So every kind of system, every kind of governmental structure will impose something. Perhaps unless there is this idea of total libertarian anarchism, but neither of us support that either. So that will be true of every system, that there will be some idea that is imposed on the public. So that is not simply a problem. It's not a problem on my side. So the question is, okay, what kind of worldview should the government adopt? And of course, the true worldview is the one that should be adopted. And I would say that, well, there are true principles about what is harmful and what is good. For instance, communism and Nazism are harmful and evil ideas. So that means that the government should be concerned about not having those ideas being spread around in society and not simply being neutral to it. It also goes back to this principle we're talking about, that the purpose of government is to protect the common good. And the common good is, among other things, public morality. And if there are things that undermine that public morality, well, then there is within the purpose of the state to prevent those from being published or propagated. So, yeah, I think the case for censorship, at least in some cases, is very plausible. And also something Emil pointed out here, he said, those who follow the truth and the Catholic Church teaching will be truthful and understand the wrongs and errors, but those who deny the truth will be damned. Yeah, so this is the Catholic truth that Emil is bringing out, and obviously you would disagree with that, but this is also a reason why censorship will be plausible within the Catholic framework. If Catholicism is true, and I most certainly believe it is, then that would mean that people who are exposed to heresy and could fall and apostatize from the true faith will lose their souls for eternity. So also from that perspective, there would be this huge danger. again, that is under the Catholic framework. But even if we leave aside religious issues and just look at other issues like, again, Nazism and communism, there is this case to be made that they should also be censored. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, many points you brought up, much to address. First of all, yeah, then you just better hope that your society doesn't get in some form or another to a state where the majority of people have a religion that is different from yours, because then you will be oppressed, and because their religion says that they are right and you will go to hell if you, or whatever, burn if you don't follow their God. So I think that's a problematic way of looking at it, but I would address your other points. The first one is, you say people will not hear of certain bad ideas if they are banned. And I just think that's a very naive way of looking at it, honestly, because we both know that government policies often don't work if they are not backed by the population. Like, take the prohibition on alcohol in the United States. The government wanted to ban alcohol, and alcohol is a highly problematic substance, but it just didn't work. And in the end, they had to give this idea up because the population didn't back this law. And the same goes with ideas. Ideas can be spread by handwriting pamphlets and giving them from one person to the next. Ideas can be spread by secret meetings. Ideas can be spread by graffiti on walls. And if you want to really have all of this eliminated, then you have to have a very tight grip on almost every action that your population does as a government. And then, because I agree, your approach is authoritarian and not totalitarian, that's the right word to use. But if you want to really suppress the movement of pamphlets or spoken words, then you will have to have a totalitarian system, because you will have to intervene in every human interaction to make sure that people aren't speaking about some evil or banned idea. So I think that's the first point. And yeah, second point, you said a person might be convicted of good ideas, but then not be very strong in his conviction, and so he might fall prey to bad arguments. And that's true. But if he has a good intention in his heart, then he will work through these bad arguments and eventually realize the true position again. And then he will be much stronger in his conviction of the true position. And how should he ever reach a strong conviction if he isn't allowed to actually think it through for himself? Then he will just be like a child that the parent says, this is right, this is wrong, and the child just believes what the parent says, but cannot really think or argue for himself, which I think you shouldn't have a population made up of people who are weak in their mind or conviction. And to your idea that every society enforces certain ideas, like property rights, that is of course true, but that doesn't mean that every society necessarily imposes limitations on the discussion of idea itself. Because it's a very different thing to discuss in an academic setting or in theory, should there be property rights or not, and to then go out and rob someone because you say, I don't believe in the idea of property rights. So you can talk about ideas, but not be allowed to act upon them. And I guess that would be my approach, how it kind of should be. Yeah.
Well, again, multiple things to be said. The first point I remember that you talked about was, okay, a man with convictions and his danger of being exposed to bad ideas. Well, a man might have good intentions in that state of having a true positions and accepting the good, but that could change. If he's exposed to bad ideas, that could tempt him to fall into error and even harmful errors. And obviously there are examples of this throughout history, and people can apostatize and fall from a good intention. So it is, of course, just as parents would do with children, protect them for certain harms, so that they wouldn't be tempted into falling into error. Even if those children live with good intentions and they want to follow their parents, there is still the possibility of them falling away from that if they are exposed to danger. So when it comes to the idea that, well, government policies wouldn't necessarily be very successful at this because there are other examples from history like prohibition, well, actually the successfulness or lack thereof when it comes to prohibition actually has been disputed. I myself also use that argument that, well, you can't prohibit things, many things, because look at what happened in the 30s in the United States with alcohol. But some actually argue that it was successful, and all the murder rates and crime thing. When it comes to these statistics, things were actually improving. And when it comes to crime, that it actually has been a bit misleading representation of the data. But again, I'm not going to defend that proposition very definitively, because I am not looked very much into that issue, just a little bit, or not just a little bit even, but at least know about it. So perhaps that will be a different discussion. And anyways, both of us would support the idea that there are some things that the government should prohibit, like murder and rape, and we both agree that, well, the government should do those things. And so the idea that, well, government could necessarily be good at preventing harms from being done in society because it's inefficient, well, that line of argumentation could also be used for any governmental enforcement of any law whatsoever. And I would say, no, on certain things, the government could do a good job at preventing harm. There should, of course, be a balance. And one of the problems today is that the government has reached such a large, has become so big and has so many responsibilities that it cannot do a good job. It's too much at once. The government should be more limited in what kind of things it should do. But when it is in that more natural state, I believe it can do its job well. Not obviously not perfect, but at least work well. At least that's very possible. So yes, and there are those things, and also another thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that government itself should have the responsibility of controlling every kind of speech in society, because I believe in decentralization, that you don't have just this state government, but you have all these different institutions that have their own role. You have the local community, you have the family, you have the church, you have the monastery, you have all sorts of institutions, unions and guilds, I would also like to see, that have also their own special role in shunning bad ideas in their respective territories, quote unquote. So it's not just the government. And also the idea that, well, couldn't that lead to a lack of trust in society, because now people will be suspicious of each other, and neighbors might tell the state that, oh, perhaps he's discussing some bad idea. I don't think that will necessarily be the case, because, again, you could have this decentralized structure in which just the local community sort of watches out for each other without it being this very thought police. You don't need to have that kind of structure. Just as in the Middle Ages, some things were prohibited, heresies, etc., but that didn't lead to massive mistrust among the people. Rather, it seemed to work well. So yes, I don't think it would necessarily lead to that. I think you have a natural organizational structure. And also, I'm not suggesting that every false idea should be banned either. No, just some ideas that are gravely evil and dangerous. So not all false ideas. That's also another point. Yeah, so those would be some important points in that regard. Your response that, well, government prohibiting murder and theft, etc., that is not, or property rights, that is not about banning certain discussions, but rather banning certain behaviors that are offensive to person and property. Well, that's true, but the point was not about whether it is banning discussion or banning behavior. The point was just more generally speaking, the principle that the government has certain ideas about what society should do, and it will have laws and punish people based on those convictions. It will punish people based on the conviction that theft is wrong. So it's true that it's not about discussion, but it was rather addressing your critique that Well, the problem with censorship, one of the problems, is that, well, who decides what ideas are good and what ideas are bad? Who decides what is the truth and what is the false? And my point was, well, every government has to have some idea about what is true and what is false. Every government must make a decision whether theft is bad or theft is good and act upon that conviction. So that was rather what the point was addressing, not specifically whether it's banning speech or behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, many interesting points. To the last one that you have raised, I would just reply that, yeah, it's true, every government will enforce that which it thinks is right to enforce. I am arguing that government shouldn't enforce speech, even though it should enforce property rights and a ban on murder and these things. And of course, also it is true that most people in society want their property rights protected and don't want to be murdered. That's why these laws have a broad backing in society. And if nobody wanted this that way, then we couldn't have a society. Then we would be just a bunch of savages killing and robbing each other, and there wouldn't be a society. So, yeah. So, you are right. Government will enforce what it will enforce, but I am arguing that it should not enforce speech. And you said there also this interesting idea that in a decentralized organization of society, perhaps it wouldn't be the government that enforces speech, and perhaps it wouldn't even be like ban of ideas wouldn't be enforced by physical violence, but by other means, like people shunning a person who openly advocates a bad idea. They would just say, I don't want to have anything to do with you because you are spreading evil ideas. And this I would actually support very much. I think this is an important mechanism in a society. The only thing that I'm vehemently against is this idea that government should regulate what people are allowed to talk about, or even perhaps that violence should be used to regulate what people are allowed to talk about in form of ideas, not in form of making getting people to act in a certain way, like, hey everyone, let's go to this place and revolt or do this or do that. This stuff can be banned, but discussing ideas theoretically, I think, shouldn't be met with violence. That's my conviction. Ostracism or shunning or other forms of regulation of behavior, I think, are very adequate to let someone know that I don't approve of this idea that you are spreading here. So therefore I will let you know that I don't approve of it. And if everyone does that, then this will have an effect on the person. All I'm arguing against is government using violence, or the church using violence for that matter, to stop people from writing or speaking about certain things.
Well, to the first point about, yes, governments will enforce whatever they enforce. Yes, that's true. And that is why the idea that, oh no, we can't have censorship, because who decides what is true and what is false? That is not a valid objection, because that is a decision that every government makes. So that is why that specific objection against censorship doesn't work, because that argument can be used against any kind of government.
Can you say that again? How is that not a valid argument?
So basically, the argument, as I understood you, is that the problem with censorship is that, well, who decides what ideas are true and good and what ideas are bad and harmful? Who decides that? Well, the government. But what if the government is wrong, or at least the government has to make the decision, and that somehow is a problem? But yes, but that argument can be made against any kind of government policy whatsoever. Because who decides that theft is wrong or good? Well, the government. So that objection against censorship doesn't work. That is the point.
Yes. Well, interesting point. But I would say that it is false. Because we have said before, there is certain things are true or false, not because people believe they are true or false, but because of reality. but the mechanism of how human beings find out whether something is true or false, in my mind there is only one mechanism, and that is talking about these different ideas and comparing them to the experience of reality that I have, that you have, that many different people have. And through this mechanism over time, we can find out what is true or false. And so we need free speech in order to find out what is true and false. And once we have free speech, then we have a proper mechanism by which we can decide, is the statement the government should enforce property rights true or false? And then it's no longer simply arbitrary, but it's actually backed by not an optimal, but the best method we have at hand to figure out if something is true or false. That's why free speech is in a separate category in my perception.
But then I would push against that and ask, well, why is that the only reasonable mechanism? Why does there need to be this interaction between truth and falsehood in order for us to find the truth?
That's a good question. Probably in the end it boils down to a statement of faith or to an axiom, because you might say, well, revelation by God is the proper method to decide what is true and what is false. And then I would just point out that, yeah, you have your God and the Muslims have their God and the Jews have kind of their God, and who is a little bit like the Christian one but also not exactly the same. And then you have the Buddhists and you have the Hindus who have a lot of gods, and you have all the pagan religions, and you will just have a big bloodbath. And so you can also go with that way of solving the problem, but I just don't think it's good. I think that the idea of the logos, of human rationality through speech being able to connect and interact and create something which is bigger than merely my rationality can produce by itself, I think this is the correct, or I believe that this is the correct way of going about it. So yeah, it's based on faith in the end.
Well, the problem there is that that statement about what mechanisms is workable or not, that is something that can be investigated and analyzed, because it concerns how people can reach the truth. It's not simply an axiom in that sense. It's more of it's something that can be investigated, in other words. So, and also when it comes to divine revelation, it will be, I suppose, more precise to see it's a source of truth rather than the only thing that why we should measure truth, because we also have just natural reason. We have, for instance, science. That's the way we discover truth, by empirically investigating nature, and so forth. So there are multiple ways. But what I would say is that, no, when it comes to the idea of a society where people grow up and they are not exposed to bad ideas, there is no interaction between, say, the truth and certain very grave evil errors, that would still not be a problem, because then you have people who grow up in a society and they are taught the true ideas, the true positions by their parents, by, if they go to some educational institution, and are taught that by others. Then they are taught the truth. They never hear certain evil ideas such as communism or Nazism, and all they are exposed to are simply these true dogmas. Then they have the truth. So I don't see any need for them to be interacting with error in order for truth to be found, because truth can simply be there from the beginning.
Well, let me repeat a point that I made before. Even if this hypothetical society would exist, where, and even let's say for the sake of argument it was a Catholic society like you wanted it to be, and there would only be Catholic ideas being taught to children, and so people would grow up not exposed to bad ideas. I think human beings have this evil part in their heart, and they will come up with bad ideas all by themselves. Just put a bunch of kids into a sandbox and one kid will steal the toy from another kid because it wants to play with it. It didn't learn this in school, it's just a natural instinct. And so right there you have the bad idea. I take whatever I want it, because I'm stronger. And so you have to address it somehow.
But actually that's an argument for censorship, because it's precisely because of the danger that people can develop bad ideas that the government should be on watch. If nobody develops evil ideas, then there is no need for censorship, because only truth will exist.
No, it's not an argument for censorship, it's an argument for being able to convince people that the bad ideas are bad so that they will adhere to the good ideas.
Right, yes, yeah, I would agree that if there is some very bad idea that is famous and well known in a society, well then the government, or not necessarily the government, but society, should take measures to teach people who might be exposed to them why they're wrong. I completely agree with that. But when it's about preventing such danger in the first place, that is something that censorship has a role in doing. If the danger is already present and the damage is already done, well then of course you have to also refute the errors and teach people arguments against the errors. But that doesn't mean that the government shouldn't also try to prevent those errors from spreading in the first place. By the way, Emil also sent some comments just so that you know.
Yeah, I have kind of been following them more or less. We can be misled by demons. Let's not go into that today, because yeah, let's not go into that one today. Some are not fully full of truth. Some can lie. Yeah, of course. That's also something that people discover all by themselves. Every child tries to lie at some point in his life, because he thinks, oh, I can just say these words and then I will not have the bad consequence of my action. It's of course a very tempting idea. So I do see your argument that theoretically you don't have to allow bad ideas in just because they can be developed by people spontaneously. But yeah, I would then still have the problem of how do you know which ideas are bad and good or true and false? I would have to revert back to the mechanism of finding the truth. And yeah,
well, that could be answered briefly, that you know that by receiving the truth positions from your parents or school or whatever, or by looking at proofs. So that doesn't disprove censorship in any way.
Well, first of all, your parents might err on certain points, so you can't just believe everything they say without ever questioning it. And secondly, if you look at proofs, then you have to discuss them because they might be false, or you have to understand them and you have to question them, and so you have to discuss them.
Yeah, of course, parents are fallible and etc. But the point was, where do we find truth? And these are just some possible candidates for getting the truth. Of course, obviously, there can also be sources of error, parents, etc. But that's at least some ideas of where you can get the truth from. So that was simply an answer to that specific question.
Yeah, but it wasn't a sufficient answer, I think, because you just push the problem back. You say, well, where do you find truth? Well, with your parents, and they might have some chance of error, but where did they find the truth that they have? Well, from their parents. And so where did it come from in the first place? That's not a mechanism that allows you to actually find or distinguish truth from falsehood. That's just referring back to the past.
Right, but yeah, of course, if we're talking about the ultimate source of truth for human beings, then okay, you have faith, I would say, but also you have reason, investigate empirically things scientifically, and you have people discovering proofs and just finding out truth in various ways. But that is actually irrelevant to the issue of censorship, because there's one issue, okay, how do we know the truth? But another issue is, okay, how should the government protect truth? Those are two different issues.
Yes and no. On the one hand, yes, I see your point that You can have the question, how do we discover truth? And you can have the question, how do we protect truth? But I think that the measure that you are proposing to protect truth will destroy the mechanism that we need to discover truth. And it is more important to have the ability to discover truth than to protect this set of statements that we have at the moment, because they can simply decay just by copying errors. So you need a method to make sure that something is true. This has the highest precedence in my mind. And you mentioned faith, reason, science, and proofs. I guess proofs would be somehow in the area of reason. So faith can work without free speech, but reason and science cannot really work without free speech, because you have to talk about what you think in order to develop your ideas. Right?
Sorry, could you repeat the very last sentence? Sorry.
No trouble. I think that faith can exist without free speech, but reason and science cannot exist without free speech, because you have to exchange your thoughts in order to develop them.
Okay, so just trying to think what I could say to the first point. Well, yeah, I mean, we will get back to the issue of, okay, what is needed for there to be truth. And one issue one thing I would say is that you could have society which takes positive measures in maintaining truth without thereby allowing falsehood to spread or having to do that. For instance, you can have a society which is convinced of some truth, and the government, or society at large would be more precise in different institutions, etc., could just produce, here are the arguments for the truth, here are the proofs for the truth, here are the reasons we believe in this and that and the other thing. And children, the new generations, can just be taught this as they grow up, and people just be aware of these proofs. And that could happen without there being some falsehood being spread around. And there could even be the possibility of, when these children, for instance, are taught the truth in this society, perhaps they are taught certain hypothetical ideas of error, in the sense that they can be taught, here is the truth, and then here is the argument which proves the truth, and which therefore shows that this error is false. So there is some limited way in which errors can be addressed when teaching people the truth, but those errors are sort of under control, so that they will be presented such that there is not the danger of the errors being spread in the way that a free speech society would, by allowing people to use rhetoric and demagogues and propaganda to do so. So there could be presented error in this very limited, confined way, to make sure that, well, the children will learn why the error doesn't work. So that there is a possibility of that. Even though even that is not necessarily meant to be the case for all children, because you could say, well, that's more of children who grow up and receive higher education, but others are simply just going to be peasants working at the field all day, and that's all they want, so they don't necessarily need to know the more abstract arguments for this and that, and simply know the truth from childhood onwards. So, but yes, I don't see any need therefore for there being free speech to do this. It seems perfectly fine to just have this kind of society as I have described. And also briefly to address the bloodbath argument that, well, you have all these different religions and they will contradict each other and there will be conflict. No, not necessarily. You can have a society which just lives on by itself. It doesn't need to go to war to other societies which have other ideas. Of course not. So yeah, I think that is a workable way to have things, do things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree that I would very much hope that people would at least agree on the point that they wouldn't go to war against another society because it doesn't share their own beliefs. That's just sadly not what we have seen happen very often, or almost very rarely. But yeah, it would theoretically be possible. That's true what you say. Um, I think we aren't getting much further, and I think the problem is I have addressed multiple times now the methodology of how do we find out whether something is true. And this is an essential point to my argument. And I feel like you are just starting with the assumption that you somehow have the truth already here, and it's kind of perfect, like you have this box is labeled the truth, and you just have to open it and there is the truth, and then you have all other things which are obviously false. But I don't think that this is a valid starting point. And so when you say you can have a society where there are just arguments for the truth, like proofs, yeah, I would agree. That's a good idea. Provide all the arguments you want. But then you say you can have this same state without there being false ideas allowed to move around. But again, that's the problem. It seems like you have this box labeled the truth, which you are already certain of, or just think it's kind of there. And I think, no, it has to be actually discovered for each individual idea, whether it is true or false. So, yeah, I don't know what the monkey and the sloth that Emil has sent us have to do with the conversation, but yeah.
Yeah, he also sent some comments. Without truth, there is chaos. Without truth, there is nothing. Yeah, I agree with this assessment that truth is important for social order. So yeah, that's also a point why truth is a common good. And that would also be relevant to what I would address your point there, that, well, obviously a society can be in a condition in which you have true ideas and true worldview dominating that society. Remember, our very first conversation was about the nature of society being such that there will be some ideas dominating that society. When you have a society where the true worldview or ideas dominate, then it makes sense to prevent certain bad ideas from taking over. The mechanism by which new individuals in that society discover the same truth are by receiving that truth from the various institutions in society. So I don't. Perhaps I may misunderstand you, but it seems to me that you were implying, in a sense, that individuals must have access to material or data such that they will make a judgment what is true in face of errors, in a sense, individually. Perhaps that was a mixed characterization, though, but no, I mean, you could have this mechanism which I've described, that no people are just taught the truth, and might be taught areas of limited sense, some of them who are more going to study philosophy or something, but you don't need this interaction with error. I don't see any evidence for that, basically.
Yeah, if you have a society that is in possession of the perfect truth, then I think your point would actually be right. But I don't think that we ever had or ever will have a society that is in possession of the perfect truth. And so the question comes, first of all, how do you get there? Or how do you maintain at a suboptimal level the state where there is at least a larger than average amount of truth in a certain society? And that's, I think, where we have a different starting point.
By the way, Emil wrote here, just to make you guys laugh a little.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point to lighten up the mood during a serious discussion.
I think he also, he wrote, one Catholic philosopher says humor is good. I think he's referring to St. Thomas Aquinas, because I recall him saying something like that, so that's cool. And I thought I'd make you guys laugh. Yeah, Thomas Aquinas is the philosopher, right? So I guessed right. Yes, yes, indeed. And also I could mention that I am enjoying this conversation very much. Even though we disagree, I think it's very interesting and productive, this conversation. So just that it's said. Um, yeah, I mean, I would say that, well, yes, as you conceded, in a society where you have the true worldview at place dominating, then this would be a way to have things. You don't need this mechanism where you need to interact with new errors or other errors. You can have this system with censorship. But even in societies where you don't have the true worldview in its fundamental tenets, you could still have a certain censorships of certain ideas. For instance, let's say you have a society which is classically liberal. Um, and classical liberalism are the ideas that dominate that society. I would say that those ideas, classical liberalism, contain errors. But let's just say, okay, we have a society that is classically liberal. Then there is the danger of communism and Nazism. These two movements or ideologies are on the rise, and they are going to spread their errors. They're at least trying to. Still, then you can advocate that government should censor those two ideologies, even though that society doesn't conform to the truth in fundamental ways because it's classical liberal, not, as I would say, Catholic conservative. But still, you could, even in that society, advocate for certain measures for ideas which are even worse. Perhaps that's the way you could frame that. Now, some would say, well, how could a classical liberal society censor ideologies? Now, that's true. I just realized that, well, classical liberals were sort of against that. But I think the illustration, at least, it illustrates the possibility of there being a society which doesn't conform to the really perfect truth worldview and just are partially correct in its worldview, or partial correct, I don't like that term, so I'm going to say that certain errors and certain truths in that society are present. Still, that government could take measures against certain errors which are even worse or definitely very serious and harmful. So even then, yes. And also another thing is that when you have a society which conforms to some very false worldview, and then the people who conform to the truth are a minority, then of course there will be something different. Then free speech would be desirable for the people with the truth to propagate the truth. For instance, today we have a society that is more and more left-wing and leftist and revolutionary and conservative, and Christian ideas are more and more unacceptable according to the social public sphere today, and that's a very tragic development. Catholics like me, for instance, would be in a minority wanting to spread truth out to the majority, which does not accept the truth. Then we would, of course, accept free speech and interaction between truth and error, not because that should be the ideal scenario, obviously, but because that's what we have to support by necessity, because now government does not accept the truth, rather the opposite. So you could call this selective free speech. If you have a society which where evil dominates, then there should be free speech, so that truth should have a place and the possibility of spreading. But that doesn't mean that when the truth has power, then we should have free speech. Now, I can imagine some liberals and libertarians say, well, that's hypocritical to have selective free speech, and that, oh, you just want free speech when you have the possibility of speaking, but not to others. Yes, but that's sort of the point, that truth should have freedom, that errors should not have. There is this old saying, error has no rights, and I think that's a good point. Yeah, perhaps there was some other point which I had in mind, but I don't remember that right now. So.
Interesting. Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say I too enjoyed this conversation. I think it really helps me to learn to argue better for my position, and you make interesting points, so just to reply to that. Yeah, I'm just looking what did you say? Yeah, you said if there's a society which has kind of a halfway decent ideology, like a classical liberal society, again, I think that's your view of it. then still they could use censorship to keep Nazism or communism out, which would be far worse. And yeah, of course they could, and they have tried, but I would argue that it's actually the wrong strategy. That the strategy of taking the false ideology to the light and exposing it as false would have been the better strategy. So yeah, they can of course use censorship, but I think it would have been better for them if they hadn't. So that's just my take on that. And also, yeah, you say when the minority holds the truth, then free speech would be advantageous. And yeah, you said it yourself that for a person who believes in the value of free speech, this seems like a parasitical way of interacting with the society in which you live. But of course, if you don't hold free speech to be important, then you can just use it as a means to an end, which basically the Muslims in the West, there have been some radical Muslims that also hold this same idea. They say, yeah, we will use democracy and freedom of speech to destroy these Western countries, and then we will make them Islamic, and then we will have Sharia law and no more free speech and democracy. So it's kind of the similar approach, just from a Catholic. But your point that error has no right is interesting, but I would kind of challenge you really to take this argument into consideration that I have made before, because again, you speak of a minority that holds the truth as if you have by some method just this absolute certainty that these sets of beliefs that you have in this box here are the truth, like the truth, and all of the other ideas are false, and you are 100% certain that this is so. But where does this certainty come from? How do you know that this is true and all these other things are false? Because I have made the argument again and again that free speech is important to find out if something is true. So yeah, that would be my challenge at this point.
First, I'll just point out that Emil has also written here, I also enjoy this conversation, very interesting. Yeah, it's good to hear that.
Thanks.
Emil here has enjoyed it as well. Yeah, when it comes to the idea that classical liberal societies banning communism and Nazism hasn't worked, I would disagree with that, but we don't necessarily need to get into the historical issues on that subject. So, yes, your other points about, or your latter point, I would say. I mean, it still has this problem of, I would say, confusing, again, metaphysics with epistemology. One issue is how do we come to know the truth or be certain of the truth, but another distinct issue is what to do with the truth. So it's not really about me and my epistemological state, but rather the truth out there. And that's the case that there is some objective truth, and that truth should be protected. We could still say as a general principle that whatever the truth is, government should protect it, even if we don't directly address the content of that truth. So the principle still stands. And yes, the truth is true, and it's still the case that the government should preserve and protect the truth and prevent it from being infected or threatened by harmful errors in society. That will still be a true principle, even if a particular individual in society like myself, whether or how I myself am convinced of the truth is sort of, well, that's not the issue. It's not epistemology. It's metaphysics. It's what should be the case in reality. So it's important to keep this distinction. I think that is sort of one of the problems with liberalism philosophically. That is, it sort of puts epistemology before metaphysics. So yes, perhaps that suffices as my response. I think there were some other points you also made, but yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, interesting. I guess if you were talking purely about the statement that government should protect truth and remove or ban or hinder falsity, then purely metaphysically speaking, I guess I would agree with that.
Interesting.
But the big problem is this metaphysical statement by itself doesn't have any value in practice. Because in practice, you have to then know the truth in order so that you can defend it. And as soon as you say that there should be a Catholic society and that Nazism or communism should be banned, then you need a methodology that shows why Catholicism is the truth and Nazism and communism are false. So even
Why?
if you... What?
Why, I would ask them.
Because else you can say nothing more than the general statement the government should support true ideas and hinder false ideas. But if you don't know what is true and what is false, then this doesn't give you any plan of action at all.
Well, or we're going to say something more, or okay. So yeah, I would say that, well, even if we just leave it at that metaphysically the government should protect the truth and prevent errors, even by censorship if possible. Well, that would sort of be the position which I've defended, which is sort of the discussion we have. That is sort of the object of our discussion, is whether the government should prevent evil ideas from spreading. So I would treat that as a concession, that actually I'm on the right side of this issue.
No, I wouldn't. Because the discussion was about censorship. And as soon as the government censors any idea, then it must have a methodology to know that this idea actually is error, and the other idea, which it is thereby protecting, is truth. So as long as you don't have a methodology to know truth from error, then you cannot censor anything.
Well, okay, if you go into the content, then, well, first of all, I would still say that, well, the general principle applies, that it is within the legitimate power of government to censor bad ideas, regardless of what the content is. So just as a principle, I think that is an important point which is conceded. But if we get into the content, then I would say that, well, again, you could say that, for instance, communism and Nazism should be banned. Those are bad, evil ideas that should be prohibited. But the methodology used to find that truth out is, again, a separate issue, technically speaking. Because, again, one thing is what should the government prohibit, and another thing is how do you obtain that certainty or truth. So, of course, I would have arguments that Nazism and communism should be banned, because you can philosophically show that these ideologies contradict moral truths that we can know through reason alone. So I could establish that on those grounds, but I would still point out that there are technically two separate issues.
Yeah, I don't think that's the case in this particular instance, because if you say you can philosophically show that these ideas are bad, then that requires that you have the right to speak about these things.
That by saying that I imply the right to speak about that?
No, even if you say, in theory, the government should protect the truth and hinder error. Like if the government or society were in possession of the truth, like certain truth, then it should enforce or enhance this truth and hinder errors from spreading. But as long as you don't know what is true and what is false, you cannot act in the world based on this general theoretical statement. So as long as you don't know what is true and what is false, then you shouldn't ban any idea, because doing so might just as well be hindering truth and spreading error. And so you need the methodology in order to do censorship in the real world. And as I have argued, free speech is the methodology, and therefore censorship cannot be a valid action.
Well, what I would say to that is that, yes, the general principle of the government should protect truth and prevent errors. Yes, we need to have a content in that, in establishing that in the world. Yes, that's obviously true. But then what we need then is simply the content, and the content is communism and Nazism should be banned. So that would suffice as a fulfillment of the need to have a content. It wouldn't necessarily require that we need to have a methodology.
No, that's, yeah, but you could just as well say communism and Nazism are the truth and Catholicism is the error. Systems of ideas are the content to which this statement applies. But you don't know which one belongs into which category unless you have a methodology of knowing that.
Well, again, I suppose that would be then a distinction between what is true and how do we defend the truth. So my position would be that communism and Nazism should be prevented, and I also have arguments to show why that is the case.
Yes, but to know, the point is about, there are certain statements that are true and there are certain statements that are false, like compared to reality. And then there is a question of the epistemological question: how do I know that something is true or know that it is false? And I, as an individual or as a group of individuals, cannot act on this general statement, protect truth and hinder error, unless I know what is true and what is error.
Yeah, I think I understand your point, at least the part that, well, in order to act that out, you need to have an idea of what is true and false. Yes, that's very, very true, of course. But I would say that, you could say, in the context of this discussion then, both of us would agree that communism and Nazism are evil. So, therefore, for you then, since you already know that communism and Nazism should be evil, you had the sufficient means to then conclude on your own that communism and Nazism should be prevented.
Yes, but not the talking about the ideas themselves. Because, so I have conceded that the government, if it has the absolute certain truth, society should protect the truth and hinder error. And you have conceded that in order to act based upon this general statement, you need to have an idea of what is true and what is false. And so my point is, the way I came to know that communism and Nazism is false, and that I don't exactly know what would be the perfect truth, but we have talked about true principles of organizing society. The way I come to know these things is not just purely through my rationality, but it is through the idea called logos, through the interacting with the rationality of you and of many other people. And that's why I feel that we need free speech in order to find out what is true and what is false. And that's why the government, even if it should protect truth and hinder error, it shouldn't hinder free speech, because free speech is essential to finding out the truth.
Well, but again, I would disagree about whether that is essential to finding truth, this mechanism. But what if we put it in a syllogism? That premise one, government should prevent harmful errors. Premise two, communism and Nazism are harmful errors. Then a conclusion logically follows is government should prevent communism and Nazism from spreading. So then, suppose we take you for an example. You as an individual, you're convinced of premise one, and you're convinced of premise two, then a conclusion must then be accepted. So since we're just talking about what should the government do theoretically, we can make this statement. It's not the case that we are now, in this context, we are government and going to make decisions. Perhaps there will be a different context, but we are simply talking about metaphysics or politics, political philosophy about what the government should do. And this syllogism would then be sufficient to establish, in this case for you, if you accept the two premises, to accept the conclusion. So do you sort of see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I see your argument, but the point is, let's say your premise number two was actually false. Let's say your premise number two, that communism is a bad social philosophy, was false. Let's say, just for the sake of the argument, it was actually the best way of organizing society. Then your conclusion would also be false.
Yes, of course.
Of course. And so, in order for me to rely on my conclusion that government should hinder the spread of communism, I need to be convinced of premise number two, because premise number one is like a metaphysical principle, but premise number two, if that is false, then the conclusion is also false.
Well, but that, yeah, you were done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm just wondering if you were going to say something more. Sorry. So I was. I mean, you could say that about anything, in a sense, because you could also say that about. Well, we both agree that the government should prohibit theft, but what if theft were actually something that should be allowed? But we would still say no. The government that's false. The government should prohibit theft. So I would say the same thing about syllogism. So. And again, by the way, when I said that, are you done, I didn't mean that in a rude way. I was just wondering whether you were finished, just so that you didn't take that offensively. Correct.
No trouble, no trouble. I understand the difficulty with the lag and with the camera, and so no trouble. Yeah, if theft were actually good, then my conclusion that it should be prevented would be false. But here is my point. The syllogism has to be a little bit more complicated in the case of free speech, because I will try to put it in way of a syllogism that let's try like this. So in order to act in the world, I need to know what is right and wrong, or true and false. In order to act, I need to know what is true.
In many cases, or on many things.
Yeah. The methodology by which I know whether something is true is my own rational process and the exchange with other people's rational process. Therefore, this exchange should not be hindered. And so now the question is, what is the more important goal? That I have the ability to know what is true, or that government should, or that society should hinder the spread of communism? And I would argue that the goal of being able to know the truth is higher, is more important than the goal of hindering the spread of a particular idea which I happen to believe is false. Because if I don't know that it's false, then I don't even know what the hell I'm doing. So knowing the truth is more important.
By the way, Emil produced some new emojis. Cool emojis. Yes. But yes, it's good that you also enjoyed the conversation again, Emil, and listening. We have 3 people watching now, so that's good. Right, so basically your syllogism was about, okay, in order to act in the world, I need to know truth and know that certain falsehoods are false. Obviously, you don't need to know every truth there is, but you need to know some truths and know that some things are false. And the second premise then would be, okay, the way by which I know that some things are true and some things are false, and I assume then the context is truths and falsehood relevant to living out your social life or generally living in society. Right. Okay. So that would then require some free discussion where truth and falsehood can interact, which I can then participate in order for this to happen, or at least happen in a practically workable way, you could say. And in conclusion, therefore, there should be this free discussion if we want there to be people who act in the world in a socially workable way. And everyone, of course, would say that, of course, we would have society work in a good way where people can live and thrive. Well, again, I would disagree with premise 2 and push back on that we do need this mechanism. Because, again, I would appeal back to that scenario where we have that society where people grow up in a society where truth dominates. They are told the truth by the parents or someone else, and they act upon that. And that would be another way you could do that without having this free speech platform.
But that wouldn't actually be knowing the truth. That would just be doing what you are told as a child.
Wait, you're saying that we cannot know the truth unless we are exposed to erroneous, contrary views?
Yeah, that's my whole idea. The process by which we know that something is true requires the exchange of ideas and measuring them against each other and against reality.
But you wouldn't say that about everything, I suppose. For instance, the truth that you are married. I'm sure you haven't engaged with someone who denies that you are married and argued in favor of your truth, but you still know with certainty that that's the case.
Yes, I guess I know that with certainty. But the problem appears when you start to think about, okay, what does it mean to say be married? What does that imply for my action? Because I could say, okay, I know that I'm married, and now I'm going to a brothel and have some fun. And I have to know what marriage entails, else what does it mean? And I haven't figured out the concept of marriage all by myself. I have heard about it from various people, I have thought about it, I have heard various arguments in favor of and against marriage, and I have come to my own opinion on it.
Right, but you still know the simple truth that you are married.
Yeah, but it's, as I said, it's not very simple, because what does that actually mean to be married?
But suppose you were meeting some old friends and they were asking, yeah, have you married, by the way, Amos? You wouldn't say that. You would simply say, yes, I'm married to the name of your wife or whatever.
Yes, of course. But again, when these friends, they say, okay, now let's go to this brothel, then well, that's probably a bad idea because we shouldn't go to the brothel anyway. But let's say these friends say, okay, now come to this party. There are some nice girls that they want to introduce to you. Then I could say, sure, let's go. Uh, why shouldn't I say that? Right? So so that's what I mean, that I need that in order to act in the world, you need to know that certain statements are true, and it's not just that simple. It's not everything. Like, I was expecting you would make the argument like you can know A is A without having free speech, or you can know 1 + 1 is 2 without free speech. And that is true. But what does this mean for my action in the world? That is not as simple as just a syllogism with 2 or 3 lines.
First, I'll just say that Emil also laughed here. I suppose that was that hypothetical scenario. Sorry that I laughed, by the way.
Go ahead, laugh. It's okay.
I know that adultery is a immoral thing, but it was just the concept made me laugh, coerced, or what one says. Yeah. The meaning of marriage is an interesting topic. Yes, absolutely, it's a very interesting topic. But again, that would be a separate issue. That there's one thing, the question of are you married or not, but another question is, does marriage entail the moral obligation to never commit adultery? Obviously, that is true, but that would still be, technically speaking, a distinct issue. Or so it will be one thing if your friends simply ask you, are you married, versus whether they ask you, almost, does the meaning of marriage entail that meeting nice girls at a bar is always impermissible? That would be a separate question in a sense. So therefore, I think my example will work in that way. But also there's, you can say other examples. Let's suppose there is some person who is studying physics. And he's studying the proofs from physics that the Earth is round. And he has never heard about the flat Earth movement, and he has never encountered any arguments made by the flat Earthers. He would still know and have reasonable grounds, we could say, that the Earth is round, and he believes that, even though he has never heard of the flat Earth movement. So I think there are many such examples one can put forward. So then perhaps the challenge would then be, can you point to any truth that is relevant to living in a community or living in general that requires interaction with both ideas?
Yeah, I think any truth that is a little bit more complex than mere like syllogisms that have just one step. I mean, let's take the example of marriage. Yeah, what does marriage mean? Nobody comes up with this by themselves, and also nobody comes up with all the arguments in favor of marriage or proof of why it is beneficial for themselves, just as the physics student didn't come up with the entire proof that the Earth is round. Just as we don't come up even with the language that we use. So there are all kinds of things on which we rely in our cognitive processes that we don't produce ourselves in our mind. It's just this idea that I can just sit there isolated and understand the entire truth by myself. I think that's I think that's actually how some theologians envision God, that God actually, he just sits there and knows the entire truth. But that's certainly not how a human being is. We need inputs from other people, and if we have no perfect security that these inputs will be true, then we have to have different inputs and weigh them against each other and come to a conclusion which one is true.
Well, just briefly on the thing about God. Yes, it is true that God, by one simple but also supreme and infinite act knows all of reality by one infinite thought. But we are talking about human beings, not Godot. So yes, of course, human beings acquire knowledge that build upon what earlier people have been studying and writing about. And there is this expression, standing upon the shoulders of giants. That expression can have a wide application, but that's also true of knowledge. In science, for instance, you build upon the work of earlier physicists or doctors or whatever. But none of that entails that, therefore, there must be this general interaction with error. Just like, yes, the physicist, he builds upon probably works by earlier physicists, perhaps even Aristotle. We also talked about arguments for the roundness of the earth. But none of that entails that he has to know the arguments that the flat earth movement makes.
Well, but how do you imagine that there will just be a body of knowledge that doesn't contain any false arguments? Like, for hundreds of years, people thought that the earth is flat, and that the water falls down on the side, or that there is kind of a dome on top of it, and whatever, God opens the dome and the rain comes in, and all of these things. So how should there ever be a state where just true knowledge grows without there being false ideas that have to be contended with?
Also just briefly, I'm not sure that you were implying that, but there is this general myth in society that people in the Middle Ages believe that the Earth is flat. That is actually a historical myth. They didn't do that. But okay, so back to the other issue. Yes, of course, many procedures when it comes to acquiring bodies of knowledge are fallible and can contain errors. But still, I don't see how that would entail that, therefore, you should engage with certain grave falsehoods. And even if you could say that in certain cases that should be, that would not apply to things in general even. For instance, a person could know full well that property rights, private property rights, are good and important for human flourishing in society. And he can know that just by, I don't know, he learns some arguments from his parents that are very convincing and good. And then he just knows that, and he does never engage with any communist or any socialist, and he'll be justified in having that conviction. So it seems to me that can work well. And also, even with the problem of fallibility in certain ways of acquiring knowledge, well, you could have this idea of limited presentation of certain erroneous contrary views, just as in a classroom, the teacher could say, well, okay, here we have the contrary view. Well, how can we deal with that? Well, here's the argument why that doesn't work. So, of course, there is some limited applications where, in which, for instance, scientists can entertain contrary thoughts. And I know there is this argument from Karl Popper, that the philosopher of science, that within, according to him, a good scientific method is one which involves the concept of falsifiability. That something can be treated as scientifically well established if it is able to be disproven, that something should be falsifiable, or else it's pseudoscience, according to him. Now, he seems to have made that as a general statement, and made that perhaps some would make that as a critique against metaphysics, so I would completely disagree about those things. But perhaps some would argue that within the method of natural or physical science, that falsifiability is relevant. So there you would have the idea that you should engage with contrary views, at least hypothetically, that you can entertain contrary thoughts in order for that to work well. But still, that's not entirely the same as having bad or evil ideologies flourish in society, just as even given the fallibility of physics, no one would say that, oh, we need a flat earth movement to be out and speak on public events and have huge debates and discussions with the physicists. So I would sort of make an analogy in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should try to wrap it up at some point, because I can't stay very much longer, but it's very interesting, so perhaps we will keep at it a little more. Yeah, of course we don't specifically need a flat earth movement, but we shouldn't hinder them from speaking if they want to. That's all I'm saying. If somebody wants to rent a theater and talk about how the earth is flat, then we should as a society let them do it, and then we should just provide good arguments why they are false. So yeah, and yeah, you said a lot of things. I don't really know how to address them anymore. I think we're moving a little bit around in a circle. And I guess the point on which we fundamentally differ, or I have said that I think free speech is the methodology by which we can find out whether something is true. And you have said that you disagree with this, and you often say there is the truth or there is error, but I don't think you have yet presented your actual methodology by which you know what is true and what is error. And I guess part of the disagreement comes from that point.
Well, actually, I have, but I wanted to also make the point that, well, I mean, there are all sorts of things that we know just, for instance, by personal experience. I'm sure that there are things about, I don't know, technology that you know just by having personal experience with technology and not having engaged with others in the free speech context. But that is true of many, many things. And also, I would say that, I hope I don't even forget that other point. But yes, well, again, when it comes to flat Earth movement, well, the point is not whether they should be banned or not. The point was simply that, is it necessary to have them speak and present their arguments for physics today to be confident or justifying believing that the Earth is round? Obviously not. We don't need them for that to be the case. And hence, that shows that we can have knowledge of things in a justified way without there needing to be interaction with errors, and therefore it is not necessary for that knowledge to have this continual free speech arena. So yes, that is, I suppose that the point which we differ in a very fundamental way would be the mechanism by which we gain knowledge. And just as I said, of course, we don't need interaction with errors for this to be the case, just as with personal experience and facts about our personal life. All sorts of arguments we know without knowing the contrary arguments, but we're just fine in knowing them. Mathematical truths, many, many such things. And when it comes to me having stated that the ways in which we acquire knowledge, well, we know that through just reasoning, experience, scientific investigation, and also through faith, I would also add. So yes, we have these different means to acquire knowledge without needing to have free speech. So I would say that in light of all that we have discussed, I don't see any reason that there must be free speech in order for a society to come to the truth or preserve truth, or for instance, apply censorship to certain cases. So yeah, did you want to sort of summarize or end the conversation in this context, or do you have some further thoughts, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think we have touched upon many interesting and important points. My main point was the one that we have worked out in detail towards the end, that in order to act in the world, we need to know what is true and what is false, and we cannot know this without being allowed to speak about different ideas with different people, and therefore free speech should not be hindered, and that this is more important than the hindering of any particular bad idea, because knowing the truth is a more fundamental prerequisite to hindering any bad idea, because how should I hinder a bad idea if I don't know whether it's bad or not? And I could address your points about personal experience and mathematical truth, etc. But I think we have gone on for a long time. We don't agree on this question, but we have discussed it in detail, so I think that was interesting and valuable. And yeah, I thank our viewers for being here and entertaining us with good comments and also with funny emojis. And thank you also, Christopher, of course, for presenting your position with strong arguments. And then I wish you and the audience a great Sunday.
And I would end also by saying that this has been an interesting and productive conversation in which we have covered many points, many arguments, and things back and forth. We have discussed certain arguments for the truth of Christianity, a little bit of theology in relation to that, and we have discussed in detail the issue of free speech. Should there be governmental censorship of certain ideas that are grave or gravely evil or false or harmful, or should there be free speech? And what is the value of free speech? What role does free speech play in acquiring knowledge, finding truth, and maintaining truth, etc.? Even touch a little bit upon general principles about metaphysics and epistemology. So, yes, this has been a big conversation, many points, enjoyable. It has been enjoyable, interesting. Thank you to the audience, particularly Emil, for providing some interesting comments and emojis. So yes, I would end by wishing you, Amos, and the audience a continuing good weekend.
Great, and then hopefully we will see you all next week when we will attempt to have a third live stream. So take care, everyone. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.